Okay, we are ready to go live on Facebook. My name is Lindsay Lapointe, and I am the state representative of the 19th House District, and that means I represent the far northwest side of Chicago and a few of the suburbs, including Norridge, Harwood Heights, a little bit of River Grove, and a little bit of Elmwood Park, and I'm a state lawmaker, so I provide a lot of constituent services, my office does and my team does, related to state services and state agencies. And when we're in session, I go to Springfield and develop and vote on state law and policy. Thank you so much to everyone who is joining us today, either in real time or later on the archive. By now, we are all accustomed to Zoom and Facebook Live events. It was a learning curve for me. And we're still doing those events because nothing is normal still. Nothing is normal, and I like to remind everybody of that. We're still in a pandemic. We're still relying a lot on social media, which can be a difficult venue. Things like Facebook can be difficult to have honest and critical conversations on things like violence, supporting police, police accountability. Those are hard things to talk about on social media. And so I'm really grateful for this conversation in real time where we can kind of slow down and get into some deeper questions and deeper answers and deeper comments from people. For those of you who don't know me, I've been the state rep of the 19th district for almost a year, and I have a background in social work, and I did various roles in the field of social work for about 9 years. And then I also have a background in criminal justice reform policy, which I did for about 7 years. And we throw that word around, but what it really means to me is that I did work to change the criminal justice system to make it more rehabilitative instead of just punishment. And specifically, I did a lot of work around the state to create programs all across Illinois that get at the reasons why people commit crimes, with the goals being better public safety, better human outcomes, and better taxpayer outcomes. Overall, when you look at the way we've operated our criminal justice system over time, punishment has been the main tool that we use. And there's growing consensus that punishment is not an effective way to change behavior. It's not an effective way to get us towards safety. And it's just indisputable that it's the most expensive way that we have to run our criminal justice system. So, why we're here today, this discussion that we have titled Reimagining Violence Prevention, a comprehensive look at violence intervention work. I wanted to have this discussion because it's an issue that's very important to me, and it's an issue that is very important to the constituents of the 19th district and many other people. People are concerned about gun violence in particular, but violence overall. People have a lot of questions. People have a lot of concerns. They've been coming to me in emails. I'm seeing a lot of questions on social media. So we're going to address those head on. And I feel like this is a much better space to do it than in the comments section on Facebook. Overall, we're seeing a spike in gun violence right now. We're heartbroken, we're angry, we're seeing a lot of preventable deaths. And many of us, when we see that up close or when we read about it in the newspaper, we see, I know I do, lost human potential. Directly victims of gun violence who are dying, that is, clear-cut lost human potential, but also survivors of shootings, friends and families of victims, and the trauma that being a victim and losing loved ones brings, that eats away at human potential as well. So there's an incredible human cost to the gun violence that kind of we've seen historically, and we're seeing a spike right now. There's also a taxpayer cost. The district that I represent up on the far northwest side that I love, it is relatively speaking one of the safer areas of Chicago. However, it's an area that has a lot of CPD officers and a lot of CPD, Chicago Police Department families, and many of those officers go into our neighborhoods that have high levels of violence every day. So I want to recognize that that's also a human toll on our officers and their families. So our guest today, so we can have a real, as comprehensive as we can, conversation in an hour, is Katherine Bocanegra, who I'm so pleased is joining us. I met Katherine, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, when we were both working in the criminal justice field, in particular around community corrections and probation. And Katherine is a licensed clinical social worker, which is the field I come from as well. And I think her background speaks to the multitude of backgrounds that one can have and work on the issue of violence reduction and violence introduction. I just got a text, so sorry, that was distracting. I'm going to turn off my sound here. Katherine has a PhD from the University of Chicago, and right now she has 2 official roles, and they have long titles. So one is that she is a postdoctoral fellow at Loyola University of Chicago's Center for Criminal Justice Research, Policy, and Practice. And another role that Katherine Bocanegra has right now is her role as a senior advisor to the Attorney General of Illinois, providing oversight on crime victim and violence prevention services. And just kind of one other thing about Katherine that I think is extremely relevant to this discussion is because of her background in social work and as a licensed clinical social worker, she has provided counseling to victims, and you can kind of make sure this is right, Katherine, to victims of gun violence in the city of Chicago. And to me, that is a very important experience to have, and then to kind of build knowledge directly from the people most impacted, victims of shootings and homicide, on what is the best way to address this issue that we're dealing with. So that's Katherine. I'll stop talking in a minute so we can get rolling. But just so you know what we're getting into in this discussion and a little bit more about why I wanted to have it. When I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about here, I was thinking about 3 big goals, and these are questions I've seen swirling out there that I wanted to get at. So number 1, I want to build some understanding about what are the causes of gun violence. Number 2, I want to share some information on what we have been doing to address gun violence historically, and also what we could do that's differently, or what do we need to enhance that we're doing, or what do we need to decrease that we're doing. And then finally, I also want to discuss the relationship between violence and policing and police reform, because I'm seeing a lot of questions on that subject and that intersection and how those things work together or don't work together. So I want to make sure we touch on that. So we're going to get rolling. I'll start with questions, but since I've been talking, I just want to kind of, if you want to do just a little bit of intro, Katherine, just because, just to orient ourselves to who you are, and then we'll get right into questions.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the introduction. I am very honored by this invitation on behalf of your state representative, and just want to communicate my deep respect and admiration for your state rep, because of her long history of advocacy and her critical thinking and her dedication, her tireless work ethic. I've seen all of these elements of her character over the past 5 years in a variety of spaces. And I just really admire you, and I'm thankful to collaborate with you in many spaces over the past few years, and currently on this live Facebook discussions. And so I'm thankful for the introduction that you provided me. And I want to just provide a little bit more context to my work and perspective, because long titles for big institutions can kind of glaze over our eyes glaze over, and we don't really understand what that means or what informs the perspective that I bring on these issues. And so before I held the positions that I have right now, I've for the past 15 years, I've been involved in community violence prevention work and community mental health work. So what does that mean? Community mental health work meant that I worked out of community-based mental health centers, primarily on the southwest side of Chicago, providing mental health care for adults who had severe psychotic disorders, for young people who were in alternative schools, and for families who had some exposure to violence. It could be in the household, domestic violence, or it could be in their community exposure to a shooting or a homicide. And so I did community mental health work, and then I transitioned to community violence prevention work. The reason I made that transition is because the number one stressor I observed impacting the lives of families that I was working with was exposure to violence. And I felt increasingly useless as a therapist, given that they were coming to visit me 1 hour a week, but returning back to the same stressful conditions in their home or in their community environment. And it felt like I wanted to play a role in a larger level of change in their lives, addressing the home and community environments that were riddled with violence. And so I was the director of violence prevention for Enlace Chicago, which is a community development corporation in the Little Village community for many years. I also did some work with the Institute for Nonviolence, which is based in the Austin community, but also serves Garfield Park and back of the yards, and have done some consulting work with a variety of nonprofits that do community violence prevention work and also provide victim services. So an experience that I want to highlight that feeds off of the end of the introduction that Lindsay gave me is that for the past 10 years, I've run support groups for families of homicide victims. This is work that started when I did community mental health work, and I noticed that after the funeral and after the media attention faded away around a homicide, families were left in a vacuum of support. They were isolated even within their own communities. People were treating them almost like lepers, like their grief was contagious. And I worked with my husband, actually, who's also in the same professional field as I am, to start the first support group for Spanish speakers, a community-based group called Grupo Consuelo, which connects families of homicide victims to help them deal with traumatic loss, accompany them throughout if there is an investigation and a court proceeding associated with the loss of their loved one, we accompany them through that, and helping them develop a sense of meaning and purpose with their life following a traumatic loss. And so I've been running that group for 10 years and have helped different nonprofits also develop a model for working with survivors of violence. And so that's very close to my heart and very meaningful work for me.
Thank you so much. That's a lot. That's necessary color, other than me just saying a counselor to people who have lost a homicide. So thank you. I want to jump right in and start asking big questions that I know people have. So we're just going to go and roll with it. The first big question that I have, and I've had constituents reach out to me in a variety of forums to ask me this question, and it is this. So critics or questioners of recent protests related to civil unrest have asked pretty point blank why protesters don't address gun violence in our communities.
That's an excellent question. I've heard that as well. And I've heard it asked in the following way. Why do Black Lives Matter only when a white officer takes one? And so I think that's an important question to address. And I feel equipped to provide an answer to that, given that I have this experience in community violence prevention work. And so what I want to say is, from the work that I've done in communities over the last 15 years, that there actually is a very long history of activism and action around addressing gun violence in Chicago's most distressed neighborhoods. It's very long, almost a century long, to be truthful. In fact, I would argue that there's no other city in our country that has a longer track record of researching urban violence and trying to derive solutions to it. And if you want to know more about the history of some of these efforts, I'd be happy to provide some reading recommendations. But let me tell you, let's address the issue at hand around violence in urban communities, gun violence and homicide, and also contextualize it a little bit in what's been happening over the past couple of years. And then connected to that contextual grounding of the conversation, I want to highlight what has been done in communities to address gun violence, both up until the point that we've been living around COVID and the uprisings and moving forward, okay? So many of you are familiar with the negative reputation that Chicago often receives as being the epicenter of violent crime in our country. And we have this misnomer of being a Chirac, a war zone, due to the high rates of violence. But I'm just going to share some statistics from over the past 7 years. Okay. And this is just related to murders. So this is not talking about the number of victims of shooting that survived. This is not talking about other forms of crime, but just murders. Okay. In 2013, we had 415 murders. In 2014, we had 403. It went down a little bit. In 2015, we had 496, so it went up a little bit, but still under 500. And then in 2016, we had 762. So we saw a substantial increase in the number of shooting victims in the murders in Chicago. In 2017, there was a reduction. We ended at 650 murders, and in 2018, 567. Then in 2019, 492. So just over the past 7 years in Chicago, we've seen an uptick in the number of murders, and then we're seeing a decline in the number of murder victims that our city's reporting out each year. And remember, this is not just one person that's losing their life. They're connected to families and social networks. So there's an exponential factor associated with each one of these lives that has been lost to gun violence. This year alone, to date, I've read that there are 407 homicides. Okay, so there's no doubt in my mind that we will surpass 2019 numbers, probably 2018 numbers. Okay, are these incidents of violence, just the murders alone, do you think that they're equally spread across Chicago's landscape? That is Lincoln Park just as dangerous, for example, as South Shore? And no, we know that. And you in fact hinted at that at the intro that you were giving, the opening that you were giving, that this violence that we're talking about, the loss of life, is unequally distributed and it's concentrated in certain neighborhoods. And these patterns are not new. These patterns have been around for some time, decades even. And so when Chicago saw this uptick in the number of shooting and homicide victims in 2016, just for example, there was a mass mobilization to try and address this crisis. Okay, but I'm going to start 10 years back, all right, around some of the initiatives that have taken place around addressing shootings and the loss of life in Chicago's most distressed neighborhoods. Okay, so one of these was called the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative that kicked off in around 2010, which was an investment in youth violence prevention programs in across Chicago's South Side, West Side, and some areas in the North Side. In 2013, there was another coalition that was formed called Get In Chicago, which was a massive investment in youth violence prevention programs. Then in 2016, in response to that uptick in the shooting and homicide rate, there was a new coalition among the philanthropic community of Chicago, so the foundations, called the Chicago Fund for Safe and Peaceful Communities. That was organized in 2016. And two big initiatives actually came out of the Chicago Fund for Safe and Peaceful Communities. And these are very exciting. So one was a citywide coalition. I think they have 22 communities that are core partners in this initiative, called Communities Partnering for Peace, or CP4P. Okay. Previously, our city has not had a coalition, a citywide coalition around violence prevention. So just think about how exciting this is, that across communities, People are developing strategies to reduce violence and sharing knowledge and experience and resources. Okay, super important. So CP4P, this citywide coalition, came out of the 2016 Chicago Fund for Safe and Peaceful Communities. And then another initiative called Ready Chicago, which is based out of Heartland Alliance, also came forward. Now, Ready stands for Rapid Employment and Development Initiative. And the idea is we need widespread effort to reduce violence in our communities. Remember, this is happening in 2016, not right now, and it's been sustained, okay? But we also need to identify the individuals who are most likely to be victims or perpetrators of gun violence, and we need to save their lives, okay? And that program to date has served upwards of 1,000 men and is showing substantial reductions in the number of the violent victimizations that the men in the program experience, but also in their arrest rates. Okay, so these initiatives have been sustained over the last 4 years. Now, I'm describing big initiatives. What does this actually look like on the ground? Because we see on the news, right, these protests and the uprisings, we see that ground level work, but what does on the ground work look like for these newer initiatives that I'm talking about, like Ready Chicago or Communities Partnering for Peace? So in the neighborhoods that have the highest rates of shootings and homicides, we're seeing a response to every shooting and homicide. What does that response look like? That these community agencies are reaching out to faith-based partners and law enforcement and community residents to gather at the place where that shooting or homicide occurred, to acknowledge the loss, to share a message of wanting peace and stability in their community, okay? And sharing resources that exist in their community. So not only is there response to every shooting and homicide, but there are large-scale community events like marches, peaceful demonstrations that are happening in response to maybe an uptick in violence in some of the communities. There are community building events as well. So what does that mean? It means it's developing intentional spaces to connect residents in the community so that they identify their shared interests, their common concerns around violence and other issues in their community, and that through those social connections, they can do collective action, okay? So like one of these initiatives that's organized by CP4P in previous years, we're living in unnatural circumstances with the pandemic, but one is called Light the Night. So the idea behind Light the Night is we can use law enforcement data to pinpoint areas in these communities where there are the most shootings or drug sales, or the areas that are the most distressed, most dangerous. And what we're gonna do is we are going to occupy those spaces in a positive way. We're going to bring sports, we're going to bring food, we're going to bring music and services and a variety of activities to create a connection hub rather than to allow violence to perpetuate itself in those areas. And Light the Night has been happening again in at least a dozen communities every single week of the summer for the last 4 years. Okay, it's obviously that activity is very difficult to kind of sustain given our circumstances right now, but it has happened in previous years. So they're reclaiming neglected spaces. And then the last thing I want to say is that there have been opening of new community centers and organizations, and employment opportunities have been provided, particularly through Ready Chicago, for individuals who have been excluded from the labor market and therefore have may pursued illegal ways of earning, getting money. So collectively, there actually is a ton happening around addressing violence in the neighborhoods with the highest rates of shootings and homicides. And so, like, why don't we know about this, right? And why are we only hearing about the protests? That there's been a critique of media in terms of what they cover and what they don't cover. Sometimes good news doesn't sell. And there may be an agenda behind what certain media outlets do cover and they don't. So how, if we're not hearing through the media outlets about this kind of activity, there's no way we can know about it unless we reside in these communities. So we're also operating in a vacuum of knowledge around the issues around gun violence. And so I hope that begins to answer that question. Do you have anything you want to tease out about that?
Well, that's really, really helpful. And, some of the stuff you shared, I knew, and some of it I didn't know. a question I have for you, and you made such a good point about why don't we know about this? If somebody wanted to know more or get involved in the anti-violence work, what would you suggest for how someone can stay aware of what is going on to address violence?
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question. So thankfully in an era of social media and increasing online communications, which we're participating in right now, there are websites, Instagram accounts, Twitter accounts, and Facebook pages that are dedicated to this work. So you can on your computer, Google communities partnering for peace, and you will find their website, the communities that they're working in, the activities that are being organized. There's an email address that you can contact and get on their listserv of upcoming activities. You can also, follow their activities on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. Same for Ready Chicago at Heartland Alliance. So I think it's important just to, first of all, to populate your social media feeds with some of this positive activity, so that we don't feel like we're living in the apocalypse of mass violence that's occurring right now, and that that the work is happening on the ground. But if you wanted to be even further involved, each of these initiatives has a coordinator, and I would encourage you to personally contact them. I would argue that there is nobody who doesn't have something to give to save a life. It can be opening a job, providing basic groceries, doing some cleanup, increasing awareness around a community event. There's something that we can all give to save a life.
Thank you. That's super helpful. So just to kind of another lingering question I have, Katherine, because you did a really good job of laying out the historical work and then just the current work in the last 5 years that's going on. But I'm still wondering, so, okay, we have all this work going on to address the gun violence that nobody wants, but aren't we still seeing a surge in violence right now?
Yeah, excellent question. I'm very glad you asked that. So, and this is a great data question too. And so are we seeing a surge in crime? Crime in general? Actually, the truth is no. Are we seeing a surge in violence? Somewhat, yes. Okay, but it's not as clear cut as I would like to argue. So first, if you're interested in data around crime, especially if we're seeing an uptick in crime given the pandemic and the uprisings and the demonstrations that have come forward over the past couple of months, there's a really great website. Okay, and I'm partial to it because it is partially designed by the center that I work for, the Loyola Center for Criminal Justice Research, Policy, and Practice. Okay, so I'm going to read out the webpage right now, and you can open up, the browser in your computer or your phone right now and just check this out. Okay, so it's www.covidcrime, COVID crime, CRIME dash Chicago.com. Okay, and this is a great data tool that provides visualizations, so like graphs, so you don't have to look at numbers, which can be harder to read. Okay, look at this web page, and you will see they're tracking what are different kinds of crime that are happening right now. Are we seeing an increase or decrease in response to COVID? Are we seeing an increase or decrease in response to the demonstrations? All right. So this is giving you concrete data to inform that question that you have around are we seeing an uptick in violence even with all of these resources being deployed? So between March 22nd, on that webpage, you'll see between March 22nd and July 12th in Chicago, the only crimes in which we're seeing a substantial increase based on comparison with previous annual trends are motor vehicle theft, weapons violations, and burglary. Okay, this website, however, also describes what we're observing in terms of shooting and homicides. Yes, there has been an increase, but it has certainly not been uniform over the course of this year, and it has varied over the course of the pandemic. So what I want you to think about, all right, is that given the pandemic and the ways in which social services and community groups have had to adjust their operations to prevent the spread of the disease, right? What kind of programming and services can be sustained in such an environment? The truth is that those who are most likely to be victims or perpetrators of violence have been vacated from many services, right? That in-person contact is difficult. The outreach and strategizing around public spaces and employment opportunities, et cetera, has had to pivot and transition and it's impossible for it to operate the same way that it did pre-pandemic. It's not to say that there aren't activities taking place. There absolutely are. And this is also available in media right now. You can see outreach workers delivering groceries. You can see social service providers doing neighborhood cleanups, etc. But this is in a reduced capacity. So we have removed the supports that have been available through some of the initiatives that I've been talking about right now, and we're seeing a surge in violence.
And then on top of it, I mean, I think this is something that most people in the public just know, but I think it's important to say out loud anyway. And actually, you know what? Maybe people don't know this, and maybe, you know, I'm going to ask you to fact check me here. And that is, isn't it normal to see a spike in gun violence over the summer anyway? And don't get me wrong, when I say normal, I don't mean it's right. I don't mean people shouldn't be held accountable. But just kind of, if we're going to be looking at spikes or no spikes, am I right that normally in the summer we would, if you look at history, gun violence tends to go up some, in cities at least?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So what I would say is, if you asked your street intervention workers, your violence prevention practitioners in Chicago, how summer compares with the rest of the year, they would tell you that instinctually they observe an uptick in violence, that it's more difficult to navigate when there's less structured spaces for people to occupy, right? And that has been something that I've observed or heard at least for the last 15 years. But I can also tell you that the crime lab, in response to the University of Chicago Urban Crime Lab, in response to the surge in homicides and shootings in 2016, published a report trying to figure out what caused this uptick. And they examined seasons and temperature and like all the kind of like weather factors that are incorporated into like summer, just so not just like it being summer months, but did we have an unusually warm April that year that may have accounted for an increase in shootings? And they actually found that weather patterns and seasonality was not associated with an uptick in violence, at least in 2016. I don't know if you can generalize that finding to each year, but in general, in terms of public safety measures and violence prevention, summer months are more difficult.
Okay. Okay, and okay, we're going to move on to another big question, and all these questions are important to me, but this one is for reasons you'll see when I ask the question, extra important to me as a state lawmaker. So I've heard from some lawmakers, and this is a question that I have myself too. Lawmakers are asking, and I'm speaking for the state here, why aren't we seeing results in violence reduction when we're increasing our state investment in violence prevention every year? And I'll put that question out there, but I also, we can go into this more later, but I do want to recognize that our whole system of public safety and criminal justice is not just one layer of government. Of course, policing is at the city level, and then the courts and prosecution are at the county level, and the state runs prisons and what we know of what we call parole in Illinois, and each level of government has funding streams that we use to reduce violence. So I could just kind of want to recognize the landscape, and the question here is mostly about the state, just because I'm a state lawmaker and I'm on the Public Safety Appropriations Committee.
Yeah.
So the question again, why aren't we seeing better results even though we're increasing our state investment in violence prevention?
Yeah, I think, okay, that's a great question. So if you wanted to, like, I'm just providing resources so you can form yourself with data if you were interested in this, is that probably the best way to identify the degree to which the state has invested in public safety violence prevention is by looking at the grants that are administered by the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, or ICJA, as it's known affectionately. Okay, so the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority is a state agency that was formed in 1983, dedicated to improving the administration of criminal justice. It's also a grant-making entity so that state funds or federal funds that are around criminal justice or violence prevention typically flow through ICJA. ICJA has a website, it's very accessible. They have fun data tools, interesting announcements, tons of stuff. So you should check it out, even if you don't care about data, but just want to know more about what the state agency is, okay? So again, ICJA's website provides probably the most accurate overview of how our state has funded violence prevention efforts. And a substantial, so I reviewed the grants that ICJA has done in the past 10 years around, in any way, shape, or form around criminal justice or violence prevention efforts. A substantial proportion of grants, okay, administered by ICJA are to support law enforcement initiatives around violence prevention. So these grants include justice assistance grants, Project Safe Neighborhood, the Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act, okay? But over the past few years, there has been an increase. So it's correct, the question you're asking. There has been an increase in the grant opportunities available for community-based violence prevention programs. And these fund localized public safety efforts. So nonprofits, groups that have a mission around violence prevention that provide a variety of services. Some of the programs that are funded right now through ICJA include street intervention programs. So that's hiring outreach workers to engage individuals who are most likely to be a victim or perpetrator of gun violence. It includes trauma recovery centers, which help survivors of violence through comprehensive wraparound care services. And then it also funds programs like Safe from the Start, which addresses early childhood exposure to violence. So in my review of these big initiatives around community violence prevention, I observed, okay, that usually the maximum amount of funding that's granted on an annual basis for one of these big initiatives is $10 million. Okay, that's not for one organization, that's across many organizations, all right? In fact, when I looked at for this upcoming fiscal year, the state has allocated 6.8 million to community-based violence intervention and prevention programs across like a dozen organizations. So you might think, well, that's a lot of money. Maybe 10 million across 5 programs is 50 million. Okay. I want to compare that kind of investment to what we pay for a single homicide. Okay. In a recent analysis done by a senior fellow on the Council of Criminal Justice, his name is Thomas Apt, and he's also an author of a great book that you should read called Bleeding Out, Examining Solutions to Urban Violence. According to his estimates, a single homicide costs a minimum of $10 million, okay? A third of that $10 million are direct costs associated with the criminal justice system, the medical system, lost wages for the victim's family, the perpetrator's family, and 2/3 are indirect costs, all right, that are associated with fear and avoidance triggered by the homicide. So that could be increased insurance premiums, all the way to suppressed property values and decreased economic activity in the area where the homicide occurred. Okay, so I would say that it is good, and I commend the increased investment in community-based violence prevention initiatives. But that level of funding is minuscule in comparison to the loss of life and what we're paying with direct and indirect costs for the loss of a single life in the state of Illinois. And so the truth is that our efforts to invest in reducing violence in the short term while investing in solutions to address the root causes of violence are meager at the very best. And we tend to continue funding programs that don't have evidence in preventing violence, like DARE. And if you want to talk about DARE, Lindsay, I would love for you to provide a little more information.
Sure. And just to back up, I mean, you're making a really good point about how the scale of our investment is a huge factor in why we may or may not be seeing results. But in addition to scale, the question that we should all ask ourselves as a constituent, as a taxpayer, me certainly as a state lawmaker, is what we're putting, the choices that we make in terms of what we fund, are they, I'm going to use a wonky term here, are they evidence-based? Does research show that that if we pay for violence intervention through violence interrupters and street intervention, that they'll get the outcomes that we want? And in this case, the outcomes are reduced violence. And to be like, the truth of the matter is, and it ain't just Illinois, historically policymakers don't do a great job of being thoughtful and doing the planning to figure out what kind of interventions will actually get the outcomes we want. And DARE is a—
I could just insert before I leave. Yeah. So just what you're talking about around understanding what is evidence-based and investing in it, okay? Again, going back to Ready Chicago out of Heartland Alliance, this is targeting men who are most likely to be victims or perpetrators of gun violence. They just released scientific evidence that is showing a reduction in violent victimization and perpetration among this group of men. That program costs approximately $22,000 a year per participant. And I have heard that some balking at that cost. Like, that is way too much to pay per participant. So we're not willing to provide that investment of $22,000 a year. But when they're murdered and it costs us $10 million in our tax, in coming through tax resources and other resources, nobody's blinking an eye. There's a big difference in 22,000 and 10 million.
Huge difference. I think DARE is a great example because most people have heard of DARE. I know when I was in high school, we had a DARE officer, and it's a program aimed at reducing drug use among teenagers. And there'll be a DARE officer, a local law enforcement officer, who comes into schools and does education around the harms of drug abuse. And I believe it was really popular in the 90s. Turns out, once we did the research on it to see if we pay for DARE, does it actually reduce drug use? The answer is no, it doesn't. And so some places around the country have seen the data and started making smarter decisions. Well, I know in some places DARE still exists. Another example of funding things that don't work, which was a big lesson I learned when I was working in something called a drug court, and when I was working in probation, in programs that provided services to address addiction, rather than just throwing somebody in jail, because the idea is let's help people address the root causes of their criminal behavior. If one might think intuitively that drug treatment is good, let's just connect somebody to drug treatment. But if you look at the evidence, what you'll find is you can overtreat somebody. If somebody is a casual drug user and not truly suffering from addiction, and you as the program director or me as the state lawmaker making decisions about what we're going to fund, if we funnel that person into 5 days a week drug treatment when they were a casual user, you can actually hurt them, and it can lead to negative outcomes, because maybe they were working 3 days a week, but you're saying, no, you have to go to drug treatment 5 days a week. And all of a sudden they're going to have trouble hanging on to that supportive employment. So this is something I think about a lot in terms of making sure, because we do have a limited amount of dollars, that we're making smart investments to get the outcomes that we want.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, we are about 45 minutes in, so I'm going to cruise on to the next big question. And this is a question that is swirling out there. I've gotten some emails and phone calls and seen things related to this question and concern on social media. And that is when it, and of course, we're talking about violence reduction. When it comes to violence reduction, some people want more police and think that that will lead to more violence reduction, which I have to say there is certainly, that's intuitive. And others want less police and think that if we just flood more police, it actually won't lead to the violence reduction that we want. So some want more police while others want less. What's your perspective on that, Catherine?
That's a tough question. And the truth is, I mean, I think it's important to ask, like, who is asking for fewer police and who is asking for more. My observations and conversations with community groups is and this may seem paradoxical, okay, is that the communities with the highest rates of violence, the highest number of shootings and homicides, are typically the communities that are asking for fewer police. So that is counterintuitive. Why would the areas struggling with the highest rates of violence want a lesser or no presence of law enforcement? Okay. And this is something that, at least in scholarship that we see, and there's been studies on this, they call it the paradox of policing, that people in the communities with the highest rate of police surveillance often feel the least safe. Now, I can speak from my experience working with families of homicide victims, okay, is that they're baffled. I often have mothers ask me, why is it that I feel so little protection and such little traction on the loss of my son or daughter, but I see police all over my community. All right. So related to the work I do with homicide victims, right? I think talking about the homicide clearance rate can kind of play out this point around why the disposition around why some people think that law enforcement is not going to produce more safety in their communities. Okay. So in 2019, there was an analysis of 18 months of data on homicides in Chicago and their clearance rates. And they examined what percentage of cases were resolved based on the race and ethnicity of the victim. All right. And they found that when the victim was white, that there was a 47% clearance rate, or there was a 47% conviction rate. When the victim was Hispanic, there's 33% conviction rate. And when the victim was Black, there was a 22% conviction rate. All right. In fact, the Washington Post is a really interesting resource. They have a project called When Killings Go Unsolved that examines clearance rates across all major cities in the US. And Chicago has consistently been ranked among the lowest of cities with the lowest clearance rate. And in that brief description I told you about the 18 months of data they analyze, we see that there's racial and ethnic disparities in the clearance rates as well. So the challenge is the following, is that nobody cares more about the resolution of a homicide case than the victim's family. Nobody cares more about it than the victim's family. Yet when they've been exposed to abuses of power that have been bestowed to officers, and that can be direct experience or observing it in their community or seeing people that look like them being hurt by law enforcement, then there's a tremendous amount of fear and mistrust that is instilled. And they're less likely to share evidence and collaborate with law enforcement, with detectives in those investigations. And as a result, one could argue that some of these cases go unsolved. So broadly speaking, now extrapolating out from the experience that I have with working with families of homicide victims, what makes you feel safe in your community may not translate to what makes people feel safe in Inglewood or in Austin. And what I've learned from my work with survivors is that it's important for us to listen to the residents of high crime communities and ask them how they define their safety priorities, because our circumstances and environment may be different. So one example that I want to highlight that I think is really beautiful is that there is a neighborhood coalition in Austin um, called Austin Coming Together. And Austin is a community that is consistently framed as having one of the highest rates of violence, highest number of shootings and homicides. And they developed a quality of life plan to bring about a renaissance, like renaissance, think big terms, in Chicago's largest community, but one of the most distressed. And do you know how they define safety and well-being? At no point in the report did I see a call for more law enforcement. They said they want quality education, living wage, employment opportunities, collaborative safety planning spaces, and affordable housing. And so at a time when people are concerned about their own safety, I think they're looking, and there's this call for a reduction in law enforcement presence, or um, abolition, abolition of law enforcement, right? I think what these calls are being originated from is, what does it mean for us to address the root causes of violence in our community? The programs like CP4P and Ready are reducing violence in the here and now. Okay, they're saving lives from one day to the next. But there also needs to be an effort to get at the root causes of violence. Why are there perpetually high rates of shootings and homicides in communities like Austin or back of the yards? And it relates to these things that are highlighted in the community plan that was released by Austin Coming Together.
That, hearing about that, Catherine, it reminds me of a few things. So I want to touch on a few things and maybe ask another question. We hear a lot about that lately in public conversations about addressing the root causes of crime or the underlying causes of violence. And there is widespread consensus that a lack of opportunity in our neighborhoods in Chicago and in other big cities across the country that have the highest rates of poverty, the least quality education, least access to food, all those things are very much related to high levels of violence. And that's a big issue. And a lot of people I know, lawmakers and constituents and people, are wondering, okay, it's just so overwhelming. Like, what does that mean? If we agree that that is a really important underlying factor, how do we deal with it? And there's a variety of ways that we can actually deal with it. And Illinois has moved forward with one thing I want to share that actually helps to deal with this really big foundational issue that we're talking about. And that is a new program that's known as R3, and it stands for Restore, Reinvest, Renew. And R3 is actually a part of our fairly new cannabis legalization. And it's, as people know if they've been paying attention, when we legalized cannabis effective January 1st, it wasn't just about legalizing cannabis for adult recreational use. We were the first state to legalize cannabis through a legislative process. And what that meant is we had a long time to hash out all the details and everything that we wanted this bill to be. And this was before I became a state lawmaker. But leaders in the General Assembly and our governor felt that making sure we address the foundational issues we're talking about social equity, another word we hear a lot about, should be a part of this bill. And it is. The bill is now law, and now this R3 program is getting up and running. And what it actually is R3 takes a portion of the cannabis revenue and invests it in our communities that have the highest rates of gun violence, the highest rates of child poverty, and the highest rates of people going to and returning from prison in a cycle that is not healthy and is just going to perpetuate unless we do anything about it. So the way we did cannabis in R3 recognizes that was a cycle, and the way we were dealing with cannabis was actually harmful to communities. And therefore, when we addressed it in legislation, let's create a structure that actually recognizes the unproductive and harmful ways that we dealt with cannabis in the past, and give those communities that are hurting the most, that need opportunity, that will lead to people getting what they need, and because that is a way of reducing violence. And so certain communities across the state that are suffering the most, as exhibited by data, as exhibited by which census tracts have the highest rates of gun violence, the highest rates of child poverty, it's those specific communities that are now eligible to apply for grants through this R3 program to address things like youth development, violence intervention, civil legal aid is another thing, and reentry. So Illinois is really a leader in this, and everyone's going to be watching to see how this plays out. And I believe that the grant deadline for community organizations in the communities that I'm talking about that are eligible, I believe it was yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
So we're really on the cutting edge, and this is a way of really creating opportunity in action. So we're doing it here in Illinois. Sorry, that was a lot about R3, but I have to say I'm proud of it. Being a lawmaker, and in my previous jobs, it was something that I worked on to help make happen.
Yep, and I think it's a good example of, like, when people are throwing around terms like structural change, structural racism, all of these things, it can kind of, oh, whatever, like that takes generations to resolve. But we actually have legislation, I think, that embodies this, what structural change can look like, and justice reinvestment to that point.
Absolutely. Okay, so we are coming up on 12:28. Would you be able to give us a few more minutes?
Yeah, we could do one more question if you want to.
Okay, great. And depending on what the engagement is like, we can always do a part 2 later.
Sure.
Okay, so I like this question because it's very specific. And other questions that we got in advance, we could probably get them answered and post them on Facebook, because I so appreciate that people took the time to submit questions. So Superintendent Brown, and he is the new superintendent of the Chicago Police Department as of a few months ago, he recently stated, this is a question from a constituent, that the majority of shootings are done by young, naive men recruited by mastermind drug dealers to do their bidding for them. So from your point of view, your experience on the ground, do you think that's true? Do you affirm it? Do you dispute it?
Well, I first want to say that coming in as a new superintendent at this time has to be the least desirable job in our city, and I commend him for his efforts. And what I do want to say is that, specific to that point around shootings being concentrated among young, naive men who are being sent off by mastermind drug dealers, I would argue is a dated viewpoint that I think is sustained by, like, old movies that have come out in the 1980s when drug dealing was more lucrative. And this simply isn't the reality of most individuals involved in drug sales or in shootings in Chicago. There's different ways in which you could support that argument. So one is that the gang sweeps of leadership by law enforcement in Chicago have not led to substantial reductions in violence. In fact, some would argue that it's generated more violence. So what do I mean? There's been different state and federal initiatives in which law enforcement has targeted a gang or street enterprise, and with the idea of we need to arrest and incarcerate the leadership of these different gang factions. So the logic behind that would be is if we can remove the leadership, then we'll see a reduction in violence because there's nobody instigating behind it. But we've seen the opposite, that when leadership has been arrested, and this is, by the way, supported by studies, okay, When gang leadership has been arrested and incarcerated, that has led to splinters among gang factions, it's generated more violence through creating competition between gang factions and a competition for those leadership positions. And that competition can result in more shootings and violence. Also, the demolishing of public housing has also contributed to that splintering of gang factions and been associated with some of the spikes in violence in our city as well. So in 2019, I heard through a presentation done again by the Crime Lab in an analysis of gun violence victims in Chicago, so shootings and homicides, that only 17% of the victims were under 18. So that means 83% of our victims are adults. So this idea of kind of like naive 13 and 14-year-olds being sent off by gang leadership to inflict harm on others is not at least substantiated by data looking at who are the victims of gun violence. And we know that the profiles of victims very closely parallel the profiles of perpetrators, meaning they have similar backgrounds and similar personal histories and qualities, okay? So who does the shootings? There's actually been some really cool research that's been done in Chicago around this, particularly by Professor Andy Papachristos, who's out of Northwestern. And he has a very neat lab called N3, the Northwestern Neighborhood Network Initiative. And what he did is he reviewed law enforcement data, arrest records, and created these maps, these social network maps, to see how people who are arrested for violence or who are affected by violence, how they're connected to each other, okay? And he found that a substantial portion of violence is committed by a very small group of men, and they are literally one or two handshakes from being the next victim or perpetrator of violence. And so there's a research out there to prove that the notion that young people are being influenced and manipulated to commit acts of violence against others is not the, I would say, the bulk of the evidence or the clearest depiction of what's driving gun violence in Chicago. So the better way to think about this is what programs are available that use that kind of evidence, like that's done by the Professor Andy Papachristos through social network analysis, to target men who may be, again, the next victim or perpetrator, and to provide them with the supports necessary to successfully integrate them into their communities and into their families, and to steer them away from lives of violence. And those are programs like Ready Chicago that is using that kind of evidence. Yeah.
And what I'm going to steal a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Because I'm super interested on something that you said, that you mentioned kind of the profile of a victim and a profile of a perpetrator of let's say a shooting generally have the same backgrounds. And can you talk a little bit about that overlap in populations, and then we'll wrap up. But one of my big takeaways when I think about violence of any kind, but definitely gun violence, is victims, and how, because when we have gun violence at all, when we have clearance rates that are low and shootings and homicides aren't being solved, and when I know that the services that we provide to victims are not robust, it's really, really heartbreaking to me. And I think there are a lot of consequences when we don't provide adequate victim services. And so knowing that victims of gun violence are the same young men of color that can perpetrate if we don't provide good victim services, kind of what should we be doing differently?
Yeah, and what you're describing, there's actually like a term for it in research. We call it the victim offender overlap. And I can tell you from experience, it's absolutely true that from when I was at Enlace and we ran intervention programs for young men who are most likely to be a perpetrator of violence, and we provided that service, the victim services afterwards, that when there was a homicide in the community, we knew who it was from them being engaged in our programs. And when there was an arrest and a conviction and we saw who was being sent to prison for the rest of their life for a murder charge, it was another young person who looked exactly like and had similar life history to the person who was their victim. So what can be done around victim services? I think it's been exciting to see that there has been a surge in funding to provide comprehensive care for survivors of violence. One of these surges of funding has been through the Victims of Crime Act, or VOCA funds, and that you can also see that on the ICEJA website. And so these are funds that are directed towards, again, community-based providers to help assist somebody at the time of their victimization and the ongoing assistance that they may need following that incident. And I think this is an area of violence prevention practice that often gets overlooked. That if you want, in addition to addressing the structural issues, the root causes of violence, you need to provide healing to those who have survived an incident of violence, because today's victims will become tomorrow's perpetrators. In fact, I once read a CDC study from the Center of Disease Control tracking survivors of gun violence. And they found that in tracking a survivor of gun violence over the course of 5 years, that 20% will experience a similar injury within the next 5 years, and then another 20% will be dead in the next 5 years. Okay. So what that means is that for every person, when you look at these stats around violence in Chicago of the number of shooting victims, but that survived, that take 1/5 of that population. And unless we provide healing and follow-up care to them, we can expect them to be in our homicide stats within the next 5 years. And there are great programs right now that are doing this kind of care. One that I do want to highlight is Healing Hurt People, which is a hospital-based violence prevention program that when somebody comes in with a violent injury, not only are they met in the hospital and they connected with support services, but that program follows them back into community and provides that follow-up care to reduce violent injury recidivism and to prevent them from being in our homicide stats for the next year.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And, hearing you say that that's a relatively newer approach, and knowing that we have funding coming, the VOCA funding that you mentioned, it gives me a lot of hope that there's a way to do things differently and get victims the services that they need so they can heal and not just perpetuate the cycle of violence. Well, Katherine, thank you so much. I might send some other questions your way as they come in from constituents, because I see a big part of my job is connecting people to resources and experts that are out there. And I so appreciate your perspective, because you are in some ways an academic, you have a PhD, but you also have a role in state government to advise our Attorney General, and then you have on the ground experience doing support groups for some of our folks that have borne the brunt of violence. So thank you so much. Really great perspectives. And we will meet again very soon.
Sounds good.
All right. Bye, Katherine.
Bye.